back and think about the big picture. So we're thinking about meaningful differences in input quality. And one standard way was to measure input differences, measure outcomes, and look for correlations without really knowing exactly why an input difference might cause a particular outcome difference, right? But just at least knowing that it does, right? And so the new complementary way that I talked about today was using developmental computational modeling. And again, this is complementing these existing techniques for assessing meaningful input differences, because you can measure an input difference and use your developmental computational model to predict if it's meaningful and know why it's meaningful, if it is or isn't, right? And so we found that for syntactic island knowledge, we predicted no meaningful input differences across SES, right, on the basis of the input distributions. So something useful is that this technique can provide a causal explanation for how input differences could affect learning outcomes, right? So we still have to, measure that learning outcome, but we can predict why the learning outcome ought to be a certain way on the basis of that input. And for example, whether it's meaningful. For syntactic islands, the answers that the building blocks needed for this knowledge don't seem to differ enough to matter, to yield differences in predicted outcomes. This technique can therefore make predictions about differences we expect in both child outcomes or not in child outcomes and eventual adult knowledge, like with that trace violation for high SES dialect speakers, which we expect to be grammatical for low SES dialect speakers if we're supposed to end up with the same outcome for low SES children's syntactic island knowledge. Now, something important, of course, is that this way is predicting differences or no differences in outcome, and that those still need to be measured, but at least we know what to look for. We know how to target behavioral assessments in order to figure out what we're looking for very precisely. And perhaps a bonus is that modeling is often faster and cheaper to do, and in the time of this pandemic, possible to do, right? Compared to behavioral work where you need to interact with people. So it can be very useful as a first pass input quality assessment that can be done even in the absence of interacting with people per se, as long as you have reasonable input samples collected from the populations of interest. So I think that's a very cool aspect of this complementary way of assessing input quality. So in general, I think we ought to use developmental computational modeling when we want to identify and understand meaningful input variation. And so with that, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this talk.